be fair, if you could provide a product roadmap for like the path to dating, I feel like everyone would do a much better. But apparently that's not socially acceptable. I'm working on that.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Virtually Anything Goes podcast. Today we are talking about digital audience engagement through webinars. In my mind, the best possible digital audience engagement, but then I would say that. But I would love to hear your thoughts on what you think of the topic, whether you struggle with it or not, and any stories you might have to share. So leave a comment on YouTube or get in touch on LinkedIn. And of course, don't forget to subscribe and like this episode as well if you enjoyed it, and then you'll be notified of more going forward as well. Today, I'm joined by our very own head of technology here at Webinar Experts, Andy Ashton. But before we get to him, I just want to talk about something that might well be on everybody's mind, or at least your mind. How do we make webinars more engaging, and why are folks not engaging on my webinars? Now, on each webinar, each webinar marketing strategy, there's always a set of goals attached to that. And that could be any number of goals, could be anything really that defines and is important to you and to your organization. But they typically have two items in common. One is to motivate people to take action, and the other one is to move people towards a purchase decision. Those typically are part of the goals that for any marketing activity. And webinars are particularly good at achieving these outcomes for a number of different reasons. Digital engagement, if we look at it in general, is very good at doing it because it's always on, it's always available. It doesn't really is restricted by time zones. It's available around the clock and it's easy to access. So all of that means that audience engagement is easier, more constant and quicker as well. And webinars in particular have an additional set of aspects to it that make that even better and make them even more suitable. Ultimately, they are available for a longer period of time than physical events or other digital assets. They also have a set of tools that allow for this engagement to take place. We're talking about polls, we're talking about Q&A, and a whole range of other things that we'll go into with Andy in a moment. And all of those aspects mean that ultimately webinars are just really well set up for that. Now, if we go deeper into kind of what ultimately is possible, therefore, is we're looking at sales teams being able to more richly engage with the audience members that are interested. And we ultimately are able to get more out of the webinar content as a result of following activity. So that is at the heart why webinars are so well suited, but we still have to answer the question as to why perhaps your particular audience isn't engaging as well. The possibilities are there, the medium and the tool is willing and able, but why is your audience not engaging? That's what we'll dive into now. Well, to help me answer those and more questions and share his insights is once again Andy Ashton. Andy, welcome to this episode, and maybe you can tell the audience that doesn't know you a little bit more about what you do.
Yeah, hello. So I'm Andy. I'm head of technology at Webinar Experts. I deal with all things tech, account management, and alongside that as well, Twitch streamer, content creator. I think about streaming pretty much 24/7. That's the main thing about me.
Brilliant. And let's get into the kind of the story, the kind of meat of the episode. Tell us a little bit more about, I guess, some of the basics and the challenges around audience engagement, particular, things that might make it more difficult for the audience to engage or less likely for the audience to engage. What are you seeing in the marketplace?
Yeah, so I think there's one thing we can all agree on, that the attention span of an audience is completely dwindling. People aren't as focused on individual activities because we've got 50 things to do in one day. I can guarantee right now, many people who are listening to this, I've got this on another tab. You may be walking the dog. If you're watching this on YouTube and you're watching my beautiful face, thank you very much. But I doubt that's going to be anyone really. So there is that kind of element of there is distractions. So that makes interactivity quite difficult because obviously if your webinars, if your live streams aren't a primary focus or the key focus, interactivity starts to fall off straight away. And just alongside that as well, there's less time for speakers as well to plan it. It's not something that is in the forefront of the mind. It's once you've got enough time to plan content, build a deck, go through an alignment call, and prepare for it. Get dressed for the day of the webinar. Then you've got very little time to do that. So actually, interactivity isn't as much as it should be in the forefront of the mind of speakers. And alongside that as well, one thing we talk a lot about is the idea of the use of a moderator to bridge that gap. We speak about how speakers don't have time to do that. So we say often, well, use a moderator. Moderators are the ones who can think about all those things that the speakers don't have to. But then we have two things there. First of all, we may have some speakers or some webinars who don't actually use moderators at all, which there are times and places for that. I would always encourage it. But then also there may be some moderators who aren't on that mindset. They're kind of seeing it as more of a, I'm going to introduce, I'm going to give the outro, I'm going to big up my speakers, but don't really consider the importance, the kind of opportunity you have as a moderator to really take the webinar up a notch without really doing much. And that's where the power of a moderator sits in. We've got plenty of content about that already, but I won't bore you to death with that one. But I think they're the main things at this point, really.
Yeah, I suppose we talk a lot, don't we, about hosts versus moderators.
Yes.
And the moderators aren't a passive role.
No.
It's an active role that's involved, that is coordinated with the speakers, and ultimately that are there to drive that engagement and help foster that really with the audience, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I talk a lot about this idea of comparing your webinars to how as it would be on stage. We can all see the difference between a host and a moderator on stage. A moderator is someone who can guide a conversation. If you just had, someone who popped up on stage, said, hello, this is the topic, these are the speakers, off you go, you know what happened there. There'd be an element of not necessarily controlled conversation, but a moderator controls that conversation. And that's where it kind of disconnects a little bit at the moment. And that's where I'm really passionate about really bridging that gap again.
Yep.
To make sure that moderators in webinars, in live streams, are still a prevalent part of it and really do understand the active role and really bring value.
It's a nice comparison. And this episode is not about moderators, but it is a nice comparison with the on-stage thing, because I guess a moderator on a webinar is a combination of the MC, the kind of compare of an event, as well as bridging the gaps in between speakers. We've never been to an event where the first speaker comes on and then sort of high fives the second speaker, and there's nothing in between. There's no announcements. There's no nothing, and there's multiple roles that and even into a panel discussion on a stage at an event. Again, there is somebody who facilitates that conversation, and the moderator does all of those things in a webinar.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, bringing it back to the topic, they don't just do the speaker management, as it were. They manage the audience as well. And a part of that is interacting and having interaction with the audience. I would say that as well. Also, I will say we don't high five in EMEA. So, that's definitely a US thing. So we're not doing that here. But, I do understand what you mean.
Yeah, stiff British upper lip.
Exactly.
Good. So I guess going into some of the essentials for audience engagement, I think there will be a lot of sort of preconceived ideas of what that could look like, typically what we see most, I guess. But what are the essentials that actually lay the foundations for audience engagement? Is it the typical things you might think about? And you might want to mention a few of those, but what is that in your mind?
Yeah, so I think when we speak about interactivity, we all have a bit of an idea. We immediately look at the tools, for example. You might look at the idea of a Q&A, the poll question, but actually it doesn't just stop there. And I think actually this is where it really separates people, is that you need a speaker or someone to really drive it more than anything. I could buy a car tomorrow. I'm not a Formula One driver just by having a car. In the same way, you can have a tool on a webinar for interactivity, but if no one is having that kind of intention, that thought, that expertise behind it, then it's not going to be used as intended. So I think having the first thing for interactivity is having a speaker who is, active about it, really wants to know what the audience wants to think. I've seen it before where some of the best speakers are the ones who genuinely want to know what the audience wants to hear about. They might ask, what do you think about this topic? And they genuinely want to know. It's not just kind of so we're doing this poll right now, and you do that while I read through my notes again and look at my next slide. It's kind of, they are a part of that experience. So I think having having someone who wants to do it in the first place is always a good fundamental, and that will drive anything. But of course, that's one part of it. I did mention the tools. There are a lot of good tools, and with a variety of webinar platforms out there are different tools that can be used. We talk about the common ones, the Q&A, the polls. That's, at this point, if you don't have those, I'd kind of question the platform, if I'm quite honest with you. I think they're the two core ones that, regardless of where you're going, whether that be more leaning on the video conferencing side or full-blown webcast platforms, you are seeing Q&A polls. But there's way more than that as well. And I think it's something that's built into built into the content. Surveys, we talk about those a lot and the value of surveys. Call to actions, whether that be a dedicated tool or something that you build into your content, anything like that, they are super important as part of the interactivity.
So, I mean, call to action is typically a thing. We don't necessarily always think about it as a tool. Can you describe that a bit more, how that works in webinars and where you would employ that?
Yeah, so as you say, we talk a lot about it as a concept. If you want to know the technical way of it, it's a link. And it's when you boil it down to that, it doesn't sound as exciting, but it's a link with intention. It's a link where you're intentionally driving someone. So as the title suggests, you're calling your audience to action. So it's a very intentional interactivity element to say, actually, there's something of value here. Click on this link and you'll find out more. And that's where the value and the interactivity comes into it, because the audience can engage with that. They can gain more from it.
Yeah. And you mentioned obviously polls there. And I think do people assume that more polls means more interactivity? Any experience with that in terms of, but what is the ideal number of polls to engage an audience, things like that?
Yeah, so if you want a practical one, I'd always say you want 1 per 20 minutes, but no more than 3 per hour. I think that is good standard. I have had horror stories where, and it was meant with the best intentions. I don't want to say this is like, oh, this is a terrible example. It's an understandable example. Is that a speaker wanted to get a lot of insight from their audience. So they asked 5 poll questions back to back. While, you could argue that's just a survey, we do surveys all the time. That's fine. The poll question feature of any tool is very different to a survey feature. And what actually happened was, you got the responses for the first question. And then the second question, you had a few less people. And then the third question, you had even less. And by the time you got to the 5th question, it was like a third of the audience were answering the poll. And I think like 5 of them left because they just felt it was too much like take and not enough give. So I think timing it right, being meaningful with it, but also understanding, you're asking your audience to do something. It's when you're asking your audience to do something, make sure that there's value behind that and make sure they can see the value. A good poll question is one that people can actually see, oh, actually, they want to hear what I want to say. That's good. But also the audience can understand where that might contribute towards. For example, if you have one that says, what will influence the content next, or will they gain something from it like a follow-up, it's always a good option.
So the example you gave, that was polls in the quick succession with really no content in between.
With 0 content in between. Yeah. It was just 5 poll questions back to back and with silences in between. I always say this with poll questions, if you're going to do them, don't just say, oh, we're just going to wait for everyone to get the answers. It's very awkward for everyone involved. I would say, have a conversation around it. I think, Lev, you're the greatest example of this, where even if you don't know the topic, you'll ask, what do you expect the audience to hear? What's a brief overview of the topic, or what's the question?
Yeah, I think with polls, I mean, it's not all about polls, but it's a great example for one of the interactivity elements. But what we've found in the past is running a webinar, and at the beginning, before even any content has been shared, running a poll right at the start, and typically asking a question of, where are you on your journey towards X, and X being the topic of the webinar, and the audience feels immediately engaged. And actually they can say, well, people like to share, where they are, what they know, or perhaps what they're interested in learning as well. So by answering that question early on in the webinar, the audience feels, okay, I've interacted with the interface. I'm being heard because the results are being shown, and actually it's being reacted to as well, because then, as you said, I think you alluded to just now, the speakers can then adjust according to, if everyone answered, I have absolutely no idea about this, then they can start with the basics. If everyone says, well, look, we know all of this, just give us the kind of the really good stuff, then it's an entirely different type of content, but it's based on the same topic. So that early engagement helps with continuous engagement throughout the webinar as well, right?
Yes, it does have a very much a cascade effect as well. Once someone's clicked on the webinar, realize that it's live, it does happen. Some people don't want to engage because they think, oh, it's pre-recorded. My response isn't going to be a part of it. Once that happens, you'll find that the audience will engage a lot more. So if they've answered the poll question early on, 10 minutes in, 5 minutes in, they'll then ask questions later on. We see this all the time, is that the earlier the interaction is, the earlier the audience are brought into the experience, actually, they then continue to contribute to the experience. And as you say, it does have a good impact. The poll question asks about maturity can then move into asking questions, because if they don't know about the topic, then they're more encouraged to go, actually. And that's, again, role of a good speaker, to encourage the interactivity, is to say, actually, well, if you do have any questions, then let us know. That's an invitation for an audience member to say, actually, they feel okay to do so. It's not kind of them thinking like, oh, I can't do that. It's them saying, yeah, I can then answer that question. So I think it's really good to do so for that continual engagement.
Well, it goes back to what you said at the start, is it requires ideally a speaker or moderator who, I think, it sort of visualizes that, and that there is an audience there and that they want to be in a conversation, even though it's just a one-way stream. But you can make that conversational element come to life through different forms. And it's not just about, I mean, we mentioned polls and we mentioned surveys and so on, but it's not about the individual interactivity tool or element, is it? It's about creating a structure or a kind of a mini ecosystem of engagement where you have questions and answers, you have polls, you have surveys, you have content downloads, assets, things like even a chat window, maybe even an automated drift bot type chat. But you don't want to overload it, because it still needs to be space for content, right? But equally, you don't want to only focus on one, because then the balance isn't there between content and interactivity. Is that right? Yeah,
and you've hit on a good point there, is that it's, it's always good to have a multitude of options and create this experience of, right, interactivity is a part of this. And that's a part of webinar culture that, as part of your organization, you'll have to work on. It's, if again, it's kind of where your brand is linked to. If people know they're attending Company X's webinars and Company X's, I shouldn't say Company X at the moment, really, should I?
No.
Let's not go there.
That's a different one.
Yeah, let's go Webinar Experts' webinars. That's a safe one. I can say that one.
He's ruined it for everyone now, hasn't he?
Exactly. The Company Y is going to become the next big thing now. But no, for your company's webinars, for example, if they know, if a part of that culture is actually, right, we know that actually interactivity is a part of that, and they know as part of that brand, it's almost interactivity becomes your brand, as it were. That people know that they're coming for an experience, they're coming to get their questions answered. And that has to be implemented across your webinars as well. It's not, you can have, we'll get onto this about the idea of formats and how they kind of increase the level of interactivity. But I think one of the most successful ways is having a core of this idea that, every webinar you do, there's going to be some interactive elements. And that's where having different interactive elements is important. Not every audience member will use every single one. I don't think I've ever seen a webinar where someone answers the asks a question in Q&A, answers all the poll questions, does the survey, downloads all the resources, and engages with the chatbot. You're never going to get everyone who's going to do all 6. If you do, give them a call straight after the webinar. I think they might be interested, but it's given the option there. And, and there are differences there. Sometimes there are active interactivity elements. We talk about the obvious ones, the polls, the Q&As, where it's it's actively involved. It does have a real-time kind of, I don't say consequence, but a real-time response. And there's some more passive ones. The CTAs, it might not be necessarily that they'll get a call back straight away, or it's like there's an engagement back for it, but there's still an action to be taken that the audience can interact with, and they still gain value from that.
Yeah, I mean, and I mentioned at the start in the introduction that there is this deep behavioral analytical insight.
Yes,
and the more touch points there are, the more interactivity there is, and the more that is designed to bring to the surface certain elements that you want to know about from your audience. If that's designed well, then you actually create a nice picture of your individual people who are engaging with you, or not for that matter, because you can tell some stuff from that as well, obviously. So I think that's really nice. And your point about the format, and we'll come on to that as well, what's seen on screen and how the webinar sounds and looks and feels. I had a conversation the other day with a friend of mine, and he was saying, what is new in sort of webinar world? And I said, well, it's, as we've seen YouTube videos moving more towards a setup like this with lights and things like that, and kind of podcasts where the microphones are visible, that never used to be the case. Dave behind the camera, we mentioned that last time. We keep mentioning it every episode.
Yeah, the first time he did this was like, you can't have microphones, you need boom arms. I'm like, no, we can have microphones now.
Audio shouldn't be visible, but but things are changing. And I think for webinars, I think there's potentially still the vast majority of webinars who still follow an old format, where it is just not as engaging, where it is slides, demo, Q&A, slides, demo, maybe not even a demo, just slides.
Demo and Q&A is asking for quite a lot. It's slides and just hoping for the best.
And it's, and then you combine that with potentially speakers who or moderators who don't have that mindset of engaging the audience.
Yes.
And yes, then the webinar is incredibly tedious and boring. And yes, people don't want to attend it, and the results aren't as you would expect. Changing that and being mindful of what the audience, well, first of all, who the audience is, what the audience is used to seeing elsewhere, having perhaps a setup like this, having perhaps a format that's a little bit different to the way it's been for the last 20 years, that will in itself increase the engagement, because people say, oh, this is different, it looks different, it sounds different. And then you sprinkle into that the opportunity for polls and Q&As and all these other things. I think that's when it'll start really, the audience will start sort of loosening up and actually voluntarily engaging rather than having to be called. Well, go on.
Yeah, I was going to say as well, and I think it's, calling back to what you said in episode 0, I think it's really good. And, this is where the video editing made it look really, really good, actually, is that we're talking about touch points, we're talking about experiences. When you're following up and you're having sales calls, when you follow, like calls to like talk to clients, prospects, whatever, if you're having the boring conversation of, oh, you've watched the webinar, but there's no insight into that. There's no, you've watched the webinar, great. You don't know how they've responded, what really caught their mind, what they really want to know about. It's a grayscale conversation. I'm sure the video editors right now will probably put me in grayscale just to emphasize this point. But then, if we add the touch points of interactivity, if we add this engaging experience that, is a joy to be a part of, we've got to talk webinars, have got to be good things. Then actually the conversation afterwards is, I see you've been in a great webinar. I see you've interacted with all these elements. I've got a great conversation to load with. Let's start from there and let's bring the value much faster than having to play this idea of kind of, well, what did you actually want to know? And kind of, dragging a conversation out to get the answer, when you could just have the interactivity elements in the webinar, create a good experience. And then when you're making the follow-up call, you know exactly what you need to talk about, provide the value straight away. We talk about the distractions. No one has time to spend 15 minutes on a sales call trying to explain their situation. Turn up to a webinar, get the answer, have the call afterwards where it's a 5-minute call to answer the problem. Much better.
Are you describing a webinar or a first date? It's pretty much the same, isn't it?
I mean, well, if you sign up to my course here, no, I'm joking.
But I mean, within the first date as well, is that you wouldn't sort of pitch for 15 minutes and then do things that aren't engaging. You want it to be natural. You want it to be engaging. You want to not sort of go through a list of questions. What do you think this is? And blah blah. It's got to be natural and engaging and interesting. So I think there's probably some parallels there, isn't there?
I mean, I'm a single man, so I don't know if I should be talking on this one, but, I think there is a good point there, and let's use the first date example. Let's go with this for a second. The idea of a first date, is to catch the interest of someone, is to kind of make them think, oh, actually, I want to find out more. I want to be a part of this. So actually, you're almost doing the dance, you're putting on the best show. You might iron the shirt, really go for it. Take them out, really ask the questions. And as I say, the first date, if you pitched for 15 minutes, that you don't go and say, this is how great I am, you want to be a part of this. If we could, let's be honest, we'd love to, because it'd be easy, it'd be great, we'd all be happy. But it doesn't work like that. There needs to be an element of, you need to capture the mind, the heart of someone. And that equally is applicable to your audience. That isn't just dating advice.
Tears going
yeah, I know, it's getting emotional. We always joke about when we're testing cameras that me and Lev have to look into each other's eyes. So this all dating talk, looking into each other's eyes. We don't actually say look into each other's eyes, do we? We just say look at each other, but I'm really embellishing this right now.
You are.
But either way, let's bring it back to the point. The first date principle is good. The idea of you are trying to engage in, and this is not just new audience. This is the existing audience. It's not always, hopefully your product might update over time. It might be the new release. It might be a new product you're launching. You need to win over your audience again and again and again.
I can't.
What?
I'm just picturing where this fits into a relationship, as first date, fifth date, 2 years in, upgrades.
Oh, I mean, to be fair, if you could provide a product roadmap for like the path to dating, I feel like everyone would do a much, much better. Yeah. But apparently that's not socially acceptable. I'm working on that.
Well, my wife's been sort of pitching for various upgrades on hair implants and things for me. So,
it's on the roadmap.
That it might be on the roadmap. Okay. Who knows? We'll see in episode 30 or something.
We'll see in Lev SKO 24.
Excellent. I mean, let's leave this behind.
Yeah.
This is getting way too detailed. But let's look at I guess we mentioned webinar formats and kind of other tactics that webinar organizers can engage employ to engage audiences. And it's not just about those individual aspects of polls and surveys and stuff like that. What else can be done? And you mentioned webinar formats, for example. Take that a bit further.
Yeah. So webinar formats do set the tone. And if you spend any time with us, watch any of our content, you'll know we are super passionate about it. I think I mentioned it on the last episode. I had a conversation with someone who I love this conversation, but they asked me straight up, they were like, oh, well, people see webinars as boring and saturated right now. Like, how are you dealing with that? And I'm going, well, I'm quite easily. It's, people are bored of presenting slides and not getting any response. It's actually the formats, the structure, the interactivity. That's where it's bringing webinars to light, because we can all agree, from 2020 onwards, live streaming became a thing. So actually with so much live streaming strategy, whether that be on the lower end of just putting your phone up and going live on LinkedIn, for example, or on the full broadcast production end, there still needs to be an element of engagement, of correct formats. Because, even if you went to any event, if someone was just presenting slides for 20 minutes, you'd be bored. Like, even the best slide deck in the world, which I don't know if there is a best slide deck in the world, but even the best slide deck in the world, if someone was just speaking at you for 20 minutes, it's not going to be as engaging and impactful as an interactive experience. And that's what we talk a lot about with formats. Building formats around this idea of interactivity is always good. So if you have, it might be in your platform, you might have a really good tool that is like top tier, best in market. You might build a whole format around that. We've done it before. We talk about the Ask the Expert format a lot. The format is essentially, we're building a whole webinar around Q&A. That is the core concept, really. It is to showcase an expert's knowledge, but ultimately the focus is to gain value to the audience via question and answer.
Yeah.
And that's where it really starts to come into play, using these ideas of the interactive elements to provide value to the audience. And that can be implemented at the format level. And that's where it gets really important. Polls, I'm sure you could do a very good, like, interactive. I do want to see this. I'm going to put this out there because I feel like if I say stuff on this podcast, either someone will do it or we'll end up doing it because we filmed it. I do kind of want to try a choose your own adventure with poll questions webinar at some point where, as we said before, the maturity stage, if we started with, where are you at with your journey towards X? I need to stop saying X, don't I?
I know, there's too much X.
But, if we majority of the audience said 1, they have no idea, then your slide deck would change. All your content would change and we'd actually present in that format. If the majority said 5, great. Well, we'd go for the deep dive. And I'm curious to see if you could do that. And you have stop points throughout the webinar. Every 10 minutes, you maybe ask a question. Actually, we'll get to this point of the demo. Which part of the product do you want to see? And the majority ask. You've got that. That could be a really fun webinar because you could do that 6, 7, 8 times and not have the same format content out of it, So let's make that happen. I think we need to do that. But if anyone does that, let me know in the comments, LinkedIn. Just reach out to me. I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, and format. I mean, Ask the Expert. That format is sensational, but it still has to be promoted to the right audience.
Yes,
with the right background in terms of the content and so on. That's all got to match. So ultimately, I suppose what you're saying is that the format has to match the target audience and their stage in their buyer journey.
Yes,
and an Ask the Expert format that is centered around deep dive Q&A and really no other content, that can't be pitched at somebody who doesn't know anything about the company in the first place. So there's different audiences and different maturity stages of the audience and what they know about the subject matter, about the company. And then, if you're a customer of ours, you've seen this, I'm sure, plenty of times, but we have this kind of, this graphic.
Or is it Lev? Or is it Lev? Come on.
It looks like a sales funnel, but it's not a sales funnel.
Everybody take a drink.
We'll put it on the screen. Put it on the screen. But it does outline different maturity stages of what the audience knows, where they're at on their journey, and then we can match content formats, webinar formats to that. And if they match, it works really well. What we saw with the Ask the Expert format was that there would be a subject matter expert, questions pre-submitted, really, really deep dive, and there was barely any slides, if any. I mean, it's just maybe a slide to help answer a question, but that's it. There's no other content. And that actually turned into something that was really, really engaging. The audience were asking they were asking more and more questions, not just before the webinar, but during the webinar.
And after.
But then the feedback, taking this further, there was a survey as well. And in the survey, they said, look, this was great, really great, in fact. 60 minutes isn't enough, though. Can we make it 90 minutes? Now, you compare that to
Well, let's take that a step back, because the amount of conversations I have where people say 60 minutes is too much.
That's what I mean. That's what I mean. Exactly. Yeah. Where people say, look, 20 minutes max, maybe 30.
Yeah.
And we say, well, we now have an example where 60 minutes wasn't enough and the audience is asking for 90 minutes. And in fact, when we did 90 minutes, there were still a few people who said, oh, can we make this 2 hours, please? And that was incredible. And I think what we found is we'd hit the nail on the head with matching the topic with the audience and the format. And those three things together all of a sudden exploded. And we were able to replicate. That wasn't just once, was it? We were able to replicate that.
I was going to say there's a fourth element in that as well. And, this might be something that you might relate to, is the idea of good webinars. Talk about interactivity. Speakers are a big part of this. And I started with that. And I think the Ask the Expert format really started to show, part of all of this is do the speakers gain value from this? When they gain value, they suddenly get interested. And, I think we have some really good examples of speakers who, what was the speaker who, where did they come from just for this webinar?
Well, that from the US. So we did the Ask the Expert. We did it with somebody to begin with, and they were based in the UK.
Yeah.
And then the product owner, the product manager of that product line that was being covered in the webinar, saw it, and he got in touch and said, I'm coming over for the next one. When is the next one? I want to be speaking on this. And he flew from the US specifically for this. I think he had a few other meetings as well.
Yeah, no, we're going to say it specifically.
Just specifically.
Yeah, just for us.
Only for this. And he spoke on that. And afterwards, he said, I'm absolutely blown away by the volume of questions we get, because we don't, as product managers, first of all, we don't get that kind of insight. If we do, it's sort of 1 or 2 or 3 questions from or comments from
that one keen vocal.
Yeah, or from a visit to a customer or something. But typically, they don't get that volume of question. We were talking 60, 80, 90 questions here pre-submitted, and then probably the same volume during the webinar again. And what that did for the product owner was to actually show what is in people's minds. What are they interested in? What are they concerned about? And that was incredibly valuable. But speakers, I think, are a key part of that whole side of things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's coming back to what you said there, the idea of, these formats, they are a step above what can be achieved on, say, a video call. You could argue, having a call one-to-one is so much more interactive, but actually, are your audience ready to have a video call where they're face-to-face telling you all their problems? We can act like, oh yeah, it's easy. It's not for some customers. They're trying to justify a purchase. They don't want to have to try and have 50 calls to fix it. But actually, if they can jump in a webinar where they're 1 in 100 people, actually, they can get a lot more. I think I can say this. They become a lot more honest. I think that's one thing that, good interactivity makes people way more honest, because they don't feel singled out in that respect. They feel like they're a part, they can contribute to something, but they're not singled out necessarily at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in terms of the speaker side of things, in one of the upcoming episodes, we will have a fantastic speaker with us on the episode. I think it's not the second part of this episode, but the one after that, where we're going to be talking to, I'm not going to release the name yet, that's coming up for the next one, but they are a brilliant speaker. Incredible. They've been working with us for about 5 years, and we've seen them investing their time and their effort into becoming a better speaker. The topic of that podcast is going to be becoming a globally recognized speaker, and he really is that person. He's a subject matter expert, he's a tech leader, and he's done incredible work in just speaking on digital events and webinars. So I think that's a really great example, which is why we've invited him along. Yeah. Okay. So I guess we're into the kind of the formats, and we are so talking about matching up content with the stages of where people are on their journey. We're moving towards away from this engagement where it's a poll or a question into the kind of bigger picture of engaging holistically through the way the speaker presents, talks, considers the audience, things like that as well. What are the areas where actually we can start to personalize that? Well, make it more personally relevant. So the content we're covering on a webinar, where by design we might say, okay, well, let's make this more personally relevant to the audience so that they are more inclined to engage with that content. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think before we start with any of this, it's worth saying, there's not one size fits all of this. There's not one way to make it relevant, personally relevant for every single member of your audience. That goes without saying, we're all different. Some of you will love listening to this podcast. Some of you will love watching this podcast. Some of you will have clicked off by now because it's been longer than 5 seconds, but it does happen, and there are different ways to engage an audience. I know we spoke about it. We can speak about maturity, but I think that's a very marketing way of looking at it. But let's go to the holistic angle of this as well. We want to consume in different content types. We consume content in different ways at different paces. Some people really benefit from having all of the words in front of them. They'll love the slide deck that contains every single detail they want. I'm not that person. I'm definitely not that person. I would rather you can consume in very, very different ways.
Yeah.
And a part of that is understanding that, it's not always, that is a big step to take, is to recognize actually the topic might be great and I might have the great content, but actually that won't be relevant to every single part of my audience. And that's where using multiple webinars can be quite helpful. I think a lot of people try and jam the one size fits all webinar in, but actually there's no shame and there's no, there's more value in my opinion of doing the same topic 5 or 6 times, but addressing it to different audiences. Doing the 101 on what is this product, doing then the deep dive on this product, then doing the use case for an industry in this product, that kind of thing. I've just mentioned 3 webinars there, and that's assuming you've got one product, one industry, and you're talking beginners and tech. So, it's very, there I spoke about 4, which you could equally expand into 16 quite quickly. Do that with 2 topics, you've got a whole webinar program for your year done. Yeah. And that's without even thinking. So I think there is value in that. And, we can talk about more about that idea. It's not just webinars that are like topic 1 across 5 angles. It could be topic 1, 5 episodes, 5 angles. Series are definitely something that is really helpful for this, to engage your audience in different ways. Take your audience on a journey. You might have some people who are very new to webinars, also new to products as well. But you can take them on that journey. It's not that people stay as beginners to your product. People mature with your products, and with your webinars, hopefully they do mature with them too. So they might be beginners on day 1, but after the 5th webinar, they're then the expert in the product. So then actually, how are you taking that person and how are you guiding that journey from the first contact of here is my product, here is my service, to then actually here is the nuts and bolts of how you need to use it and the best practices around that. Having those steps really accommodates for different audience journeys, but also just an audience journey end of that we need to consider. It's not just standalone webinars. It's not right topic 1, topic 2, and there's no link. Having that kind of flow between the webinars really adapts and engages with different audience types.
Yeah, I mean we've seen that before, plenty of all the time, really. Where if one webinar is engaging and interesting to the audience, they're much more likely to return for another one if that's available, if that's been planned already. And that's, coming back to what you said at the start about the call to action, the CTA, effectively, it's a link, it's dressed up differently. But, if you can link people to the next one, say you like this one, come to the next one. And you can click on it and it automatically registers you and it brings you across. And, you're taking with you 20%, 30% of the audience that joined you in the first place. So actually you're building the audience. And I think that's probably, one of the big benefits of audience engagement. It's not just the insight you get, but actually the loyalty you get from audiences as well, to say, I love this one. And if I can now sign up for the next one, I'll happily attend. I might not have time today to watch it, another one, but actually if it happens in 2 weeks time, yes, I'll be with you and sign me up. Right?
Absolutely. I think it's where, interactivity and value link together so closely. And it's something that I'm very passionate about, is the idea of constantly providing value to an audience. And that's where interactivity sits. If interactivity has no value to an audience, then there's no point in it. But if your audience see value in it, whether that be asking a question, getting a question answered, or even providing more information through links, CTAs, surveys, series, that's where it really starts to shine, when actually the audience can see that increased value. And that's where they're interacting with you by clicking on the link and signing up to the next webinar. That is value in itself, and that's interaction. But I mean, one thing we haven't mentioned actually is series. I think do we want to talk about series? I think there's always a fun thing about series, because I've spoke a lot about this recently, because I think we're talking about it a lot and there's a lot of value in series. But I don't know, what have you found anything that's like? I think there's a lot of conversations about does it work, doesn't it work? I think I've seen great examples. I've seen some that could have got there, but maybe haven't seen the full picture yet. Have you seen anything like that recently?
No, I think the series side of things is relevant because it has a couple of different benefits. One, it typically is the same speaker, and a lot of teams will struggle with finding volumes of speakers, having pools of speakers available who can, not at the drop of a hat, but as part of a planned activity, be available and talk on it, because they're busy people. Because typically, if they're subject matter experts, they'll be in demand elsewhere as well. So I think series, if you can secure one and it's predictable, and okay, we're doing one webinar a month for 4 months. It can be the same speaker. You don't have to find 4 speakers. I think that's a really important benefit, but element of making that work as well. And as you say, any topic, anything that you can present in 1 hour typically is rich enough to also present in 4 times 1 hour. You can go into more detail. And I think if the audience is right, and even if you structure it in a way that actually a series might be aimed at different maturity stages of an audience, actually different audience elements, but people can grow with that.
Yeah.
So in the first one, you take a quarter of the topic and go into deep dive, and then the second one is the second quarter of the topic and go into deep dive. You can actually bring people along on that journey and educate them as you go along. I think the other element of that sort of approach is that you can spread out the topic, but at the same time, you don't want to necessarily always cover all of the topic.
Yes.
I think one of the things that I like to talk about is leave some of the topic to the imagination, because that fosters engagement as well. Yes. If you're covering, and we've had plenty of debrief calls with speakers after the webinar where there were no questions at all, and it was a great webinar. And they're like, well, why was there no questions? And we said, well, you covered everything so comprehensively. There was literally no questions left to be asked because it was so detailed, and that's great because it's people would have taken value from it immediately. However, they also didn't ask anything, and therefore they didn't reveal anything about their thoughts on the topic, and it was kind of a boxed off, closed off activity. That was it. It was done. It was over, covered, brilliant, got it, I'm gone. Whereas if you cover 80% of the topic, people are like, oh, what about this bit? And can you tell me more about that? And it invites questions, and that actually, I think, engages the audience in a very subtle way, because you're leaving some of it to kind of be teased out still.
Yeah, and I think let's use this as an extreme example, but it's a good example to be used. If your audience are not getting to the end of the webinar and 100% of your audience aren't buying straight away, this principle is applicable to you. We talk about this idea of it's great content, no one's asking questions, so they'll have all the questions answered. I don't think that's always the case necessarily, but sometimes they need a push to actually ask those 2 remaining questions to get to the sale. Unless they're making that sale, as I say, unless your audience are 100% getting the credit cards out at the end of the webinar, then there's space for this to happen. And I think we speak about interactivity. I love how everything's linked today. We'll bring it back to the top. The idea of people have limited time, but we also have limited time in webinars. Breathing space is really important, and actually having breathing space to ask questions, to interact. That's where a series can be really helpful, because you might be able to jam the whole topic in 1 hour. If you start at top of the hour, don't stop until the top of the next hour. But actually, what if you were to say only do 40 minutes of content over 2 to 3 webinars, but then actually leave 10, 15 minutes for Q&A, have a poll question at the start, have a poll question at the end. You've then got space to interact, but you're still presenting all the content and taking your audience on a journey. And we've not spoken about this, actually. You can take speakers on a journey as well. I think it's, we see the idea of, speakers always having to be ready for it. And, there are some companies who maybe aren't used to it yet, who haven't got speakers ready. What if you use the series and the journey to allow them to learn the content and give them the structure? Say, actually, right, your first call deck today. Next month, you're going to learn this deck. And they then know they've got a month each time to learn a deck, really refine it. And then by the end of that, you've got crazy good speakers who can present a whole journey. And then they've actually built up all the skills so that whatever webinar they go on next, they then know what they're doing and they can present a good webinar end of.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. I mean, we've covered the basics, the essentials, the basics, the kind of limitations of webinars. And we've gone into kind of the best practices as well in terms of, what tactics can webinar organizers employ to create more engagement, foster that engagement, get more out of that for the audience as well as for the organizer themselves. What we'll be looking at, and we'll do this in part 2 of this episode, So come join us for that one again. We'll start looking at the actual real deep benefits beyond just having a conversational type webinar. The benefits of audience engagement throughout the webinar and as a sort of holistic approach. What are the benefits to the organizers? What are the benefits to the audience? We'll also look at how to take that audience engagement beyond the webinar itself. So, if you're lucky, you've got 45, 60 minutes of engagement, but how can you extend that beyond the webinar itself and actually do something that with the audience that engages them past that as well? And then we'll look at what actually is the difference between those webinars and those speakers who manage to really engage and appeal to an audience and those who perhaps are lacking on that area as well. I'm sure we've seen webinars that were fantastic, where you come away and you think, love that, that was brilliant. And then others where you think, actually, you know what, 8 minutes in, I can't deal with this, I'm gonna have to leave. So we're gonna look at kind of what those aspects are that really set aside a webinar or a speaker from the competition in that area and really makes them shine. For that, you need to join us for part 2. Andy, you'll be with us again for part 2 as well. But we look forward to seeing you there. And in the meantime, don't forget to subscribe and like if you enjoyed this episode. Leave your comments below if you have any stories as well. And we'll see you in part 2.